Terry Bradshaw, quarterback. Pittsburgh Steelers.
It's 7:15. There's a new home run champion of all time, and it's Henry Aaron.
This is baseball, Major League Baseball. And this is
ABC's Monday Night Baseball, live from Fenway Park in Boston, Massachusetts.
Looking. He's under the gun. He's fired. He throws. Hit it.
That opening for the show, and the part that gets me each time is the down goes Frazier. I love that. So that's part of our opening montage for the Past Our Prime podcast. My name is Scott Johnston. Thanks for joining us. I want to give a shout out to Jeremy, who's the guy behind the scenes that makes this work. Three technical illiterate idiots who look at Jeremy all the time going, does it work?
Can you help us?
What's the USB cord?
Does the computer turn on or off?
Upload or download? So it's so true. And wanted to also give a shout out to the place we're at. It's called Founder. If you need to record a podcast or to rent an office setting, go to Founder, Foundr space, Founder space. They left the E out of there for some reason. Founderspace.com. They have 2 locations, one in Pasadena, one in Rancho Cucamonga. So anyway, welcome to the show. We got Billy Hoffman here, and I did it again.
That's my brother.
And Mark Mahoney.
Nice.
We like it.
Billy Hoffman sounds pretty nice.
It does.
I think I'm going to change my
Billy
name
Hoffman.
to Bill. Are you
Yeah.
going to change yours to Mark?
I think, yeah.
Damn it!
Yeah.
Son of a...
Yeah, what are you doing? It's
Curmudgeon.
all right. I like Billy Hoffman.
All right.
Billy Hoffman.
Bill Mahoney. I got to get his name right. All right. And Mark Hoffman.
We're going to call you John Scottskin.
Hey, we're looking back at the March 4th, 1974 issue as we get into the month of March. Spring is coming, and so they put tennis people on the cover. I say people, plural. Jimmy Connors was just becoming the top player in the world. So an interesting article on Jimmy, and on the inlet of the cover was the woman that he was dating at the time. You may have heard of her. Chris Evert.
Hey.
Yes.
Yeah, pretty good herself.
Who was dominating women's tennis back then. So they were
That was a power couple.
One of the original
power
couples of tennis. They were engaged. They weren't just dating. They were engaged. Spoiler alert, they did not get married, but we'll get to that later. Kirkpatrick, legendary Sports Illustrated writer who covered college basketball and tennis for them. He writes the cover story of this issue. He'll be joining us later on to talk about Jimbo, more probably about what Jimmy was like off the court than his on the court stuff. Wasn't the most liked young lad back in the day, but you know, we were all kind of obnoxious and annoying when we were.
Speak for yourself.
He was
I was an angel.
But he was disliked. Mark still is an angel, so he's a good guy.
Well, I was just going to say, it's weird because Bill and I were talking earlier about how when we were 18, 19, 20, just complete jackasses.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Mark was not.
No.
But then, fast forward, Bill and I have matured.
Yes.
Now Mark's the idiot.
Yes.
Well, that happens in life.
Yeah.
Right?
I used to help little ladies across the street,
Yes,
you
you
know.
did.
Right. You're like Benjamin Button. You're getting more
Now,
more
Mark,
immature by the day.
and Mark, when you worked at the movie theater, did you take people to their seats?
I would sometimes do that.
I knew it.
Right. And then he would stay and watch the
The
movie.
movie.
I would.
That's how he's seen everything since the early 50s.
Yeah, my big thrill was, I remember my last job at the movie theater was the Kramer versus Kramer premiere. And the actor John Voight was there, and I said, "Mr. Voight, can I help you to your seat?" And he put his arm around me. He said, "No, son, that's okay. I can find it myself." So
The champ.
Hobnobbing, buddy. Hobnobbing. Right.
That was a real uplifting film.
It was. Laugh a minute. You didn't stop laughing.
Whatever happened to those actors, Hoffman and Streep? Did they do anything?
Nothing. No.
She did nothing.
No.
Never won an Oscar, that one.
No. Hey, scorecard this week. Of course, that's where SI usually starts their issues, and I got nothing. But I know you guys do. So let's start.
We'll make it.
Mark, what jumped off the pages for you?
The first one is Hank Aaron. They actually made him sit out the first 3 games in Cincinnati because they wanted him to break the home run record in Atlanta.
So when you say they, was that
The Atlanta Braves?
It was the Braves, not
Right.
Major League Baseball.
No, it was Atlanta Braves. And I guess attendance in Atlanta wasn't great at that time either. This is right before TBS in Atlanta became a powerhouse again. So this was a way of getting a lot of people and
In
keeping
the
them.
stands.
They didn't want him breaking Ruth's record in Cincinnati. They wanted him doing it in Atlanta.
But kind of interesting. I mean, we're talking April. You're kind of giving up on the season a little early if you're going to sit one of your best players, against the big red machine back then. I mean, I get it, but also, the funny thing is now Major League Baseball would completely Atlanta would start the year now with 20 of their first 23 games at home. They would make sure that they were playing at home and give him the best chance.
Well, I just remember the Braves not being good when I was growing up. They became good, but at the time they weren't that good, so to have them do it in Atlanta, but really was just to get the fans in the stands.
And Aaron was trending downward now in his career. He was not the same player.
Billy, anything from scorecard for you?
Just about parrots being brought over from Mexico were smuggled in socks. Then they were their feed was drenched with tequila, so that kept the birds quiet when they took them over the border. Yeah, see? Boy, those parrots.
It would be so nice if that's what we were still bringing in from Mexico. Was just parrots. Drunk parrots.
Get out of here.
I'm going to crap all over your car, Bill Mahoney.
Give me that girl.
Where's Bill Hoffman?
He's with Mark Mahoney.
Mark?
So streaking was this fad around 1974 where at colleges, kids would take their clothes off and go run.
Yeah.
Go run for a mile or whatever, completely naked, And so...
I lived in the Bay Area at the time, which was probably the streaking capital of the world, because those people were beyond weird. And, as a 6-year-old, have you ever been to a nude beach?
In the Virgin Islands, we rolled into one because the current took us there.
Yeah. Well,
it's not good.
It's not good.
It's not good, man.
It is not good.
Actually, I was at a topless beach, not a nude beach.
Okay, yeah.
No, I've been down.
These are people you do not want to see naked.
No, you don't. You don't.
And I get the feeling, nudity and running is not your friend.
And Scott, didn't you when we had lunch in Pasadena, isn't that where Will Ferrell did his streaking thing?
Ah, that's right.
You showed me that.
Old school,
that's
Yeah.
right. We're going streaking!
Right. That's streaking to me, just a bunch of drunk idiots.
Yes.
But actually sober people just taking their clothes off and going for a run, I don't get it.
And
no
this
interest.
thing, it said Western Carolina and the University of Cullowhee, North Carolina, was claiming the championship on 141 streakers, 113 men, 28 women. But it's hard to, prove who was the championship. But the most famous streaking incident occurred in 1974. It was at the Oscars.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
And David Niven was up presenting, and all of a sudden, you could only see the guy from about the waist up.
Thank God.
With, long hair, mustache, comes running by, and David Niven's kind of like, what was everyone laughing? He's kind of turning his head around, and the guy ran by him, and his name was Robert Orrell, I believe. Opal, I'm sorry, Robert Opal, O-P-E-L. And he posed as a journalist is how he got in, which today, obviously, you need more credentials than just saying, oh, yeah, I'm a writer. I
write a blog.
Yeah, I'm with Pastor Prime. I'm supposed to be out there. But he got in there, and apparently David Niven said the only lap that man's going to get in his life is now when he shows off his shortcomings, basically, like that stuff.
Right.
And what the sad part was, this guy Opal died 5 years later. He was murdered. He had an art shop or something, and he was getting robbed, and he got shot and killed 5 years after that. Not as to be a Debbie Downer here, but
Yeah, thanks.
or a Mark Downer. But
Son of a-
just a tip that I'll use the Oscars, not the streaking, as a trivia question for our 50-50 later today.
You guys want a joke that sort of plays off? Maybe not streaking, but something like that?
Sure.
It's a true story.
Okay.
There was a guy just wrapped himself in cellophane. All he did, wrapped himself. He went into the doctor. The doctor said, "Yep, I can see her nuts."
I think you've told that one before.
There you go. What? You don't get testy. Come on.
But hey, the one other thing on the Said It, as I segue out of that, Johnny Bench said on NCAA Decision that a pro in one sport could be an amateur in another. He goes, quote, "I'm going back to play college basketball for John Wooden could use me." So can you imagine Johnny Bench playing for UCLA basketball?
I can imagine he'd be
Him
on
doing
the bench.
anything.
Yeah.
Johnny Bench was, I think, he was probably a great athlete in all those sports. Also, he could sing, so.
You know, I find that most of these athletes
Yes.
are, there's very few guys that are like, yeah, I was really good at basketball, but I sucked at football.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm one of the top 50 basketball players of all time. But man, you throw a football to me and I don't know what's going on. I mean, these guys were just unbelievable.
You get the genetic lottery, or you
Right.
get none.
Right.
You can't play any sports, or you
Right.
can play all of them.
The best part is to watch, like, you get an athlete from a different sport throwing out a first pitch at a ball game.
Yeah.
And some of them you're going, how are they so good in their sport?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
they cannot
Yeah.
throw a baseball.
Sugar Ray Leonard threw it into the Rockies dugout when he did one in the spring training years ago.
Boxing might be the one exception to my theory there. Who's your favorite Hoosier? First article in this issue about the basketball team, now coached by a young coach by the name of Bobby Knight. He went on to become a famous/infamous coach, but took their program to new heights. So they were doing very well, but this article really centers around their dominant swimming team.
Right. I had no idea Indiana
Right?
was a power in swimming.
Well, first of all, I mean, doesn't just common sense suggest that Florida, California, maybe even like a Hawaii,
a sunny spot for the most part. Yeah.
But
you
a
know,
lot
like
of the
Indiana.
a lot of these swimming competitions are swum inside.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
So
most.
So that's why. But here's the amazing thing. So that year in '74, Indiana actually ended up losing to SC in the championship by 1 point, 339 to 338.
Wow.
USC had finished second to Indiana the previous 4 years. So Indiana was on a 4-year championship streak going there.
Yeah, they had just won their 100th straight dual meet, which is 12 more than what UCLA had won in their amazing streak.
Mm-hmm.
When they beat Cincinnati, the coach wasn't that stunned. The coach of Cincinnati, in fact, when it was over, he went into the Indiana locker room and had a piece of their celebratory cake. So he was enjoying the fruits of losing. But yeah, they hadn't lost in 8 years, and their coach, a guy by the name of James Councilman, was 162-6 in dual meets in his 17 years at Indiana University. Not that often that we're going to talk about Indiana swimming, but I think where did Mark Spitz go?
That's right. Yeah, I was just about to say it's one thing I took from that.
Yeah.
That Mark Spitz helped them win 6 straight swimming and diving championships from '68 to '73.
Right.
Just they had some great swimmers there. Probably still
And
do.
for the 4 people below the age of 30 that listen to this show, Mark Spitz was our generation's Michael Phelps.
That's right.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Old Man River of Golf, Sam Snead, and he was indeed the old man of golf. The tournament that Snead was playing in was named after Jackie Gleason. Now, that right then shows you how old, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who have never heard of Jackie Gleason, famous for playing Ralph Cramden in The Honeymooners, funny actor. And this was the Jackie Gleason Invitational or something like that.
That year, Sam Snead played at the LA Open when it wasn't called Genesis, it was LA Open. And he's 61 years old. He shot a 66 in the third round. And what's really scary, we're talking about him as an old man. Sam Snead was 3 years younger than me when he did this.
Yeah. Are you golfing?
Which makes me feel really ancient, but hey, that's another story. But I think I look better than Sam Snead.
You do, especially now.
You're a sexy guy.
He's been dead for 21 years.
He's just bones now.
Oh, God.
Snead won his first tour event in 1936, and this was his last win was in 1965. 29 years later, he still thought he could win, and as you just said, Mark, came close a few times, but as it turns out, 1965 was the last time that he won. He had a case of the yips. He was missing a bunch of short putts. So he changed his putting style to where he would hold the putter kind of like in front of him. It's not on the side, but in front, and kind of push the putter. Very, very odd, but became successful for him. He said he didn't care how it looked as long as it was working. The name of the game is putting the ball and picking up a check.
And he picked up a lot of checks.
That is exactly right. That is exactly what golf is.
Right.
Yeah.
He won 7 majors, so he picked up a lot of checks. Yep. And that same year, in 1974, he was inducted into the World Golf Hall of Fame.
But also, you look at his career, 82 tour wins. He won a grand total of $713,000. A little bit more than that. But I'm saying, nowadays, that puts you, a multi-millionaire.
On that same track, he was the leading money winner in 1938. He won just over $19,000.
Yeah.
But I wonder what it would translate to today. Like, what was $19,000 back then? I don't know.
Probably like 200,000.
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, but at 61, he was the oldest player to make the cut at a U.S. Open. He finished second at the LA Open at 61. He also played 6 decades. That's a golfer.
You mentioned 82 tour wins. There's only one other guy that has that many tour wins.
Yep. Does it begin with a T?
It begins with a T.
Yep.
He's back and playing again.
Yeah, he's coming up. Yeah, he's
Tiger
coming up.
Woods.
Yes, he is.
Woods.
I always thought it was just he sounded like a fun guy. He'd always ask his Pro-Am partner, "What's your handicap?" When he was told, he'd look at his watch and say, "Well, I don't know if I have that much time to play." So he's, he'd have fun.
Yeah. Al Dark at the top of the stairs is an interesting in that it's about the A's had just won 2 straight World Series, 72 and 73, and yet they were without a manager. Dick Williams guided the A's to those 2 World Series championships, but then he wanted to leave. He wanted to go to the Yankees, but he was still under contract. So Charlie Finley said, "No, I'm not letting you go." And Major League Baseball intervened. And long story short, Dick Williams didn't go to the Yankees, but he was not the manager of the A's anymore. So they brought in Alvin Dark. Alvin Dark was hired by Charlie Finley to manage the A's in 1966 and fired in 1967.
When they were in Kansas City.
Right, that's correct. They remained close, and with just a few days until spring training started, which seems to be how the A's have operated for the last 60 years, that they start things right as spring training is getting underway.
You know that.
Inside joke. Finley asked him to fly to Oakland to talk. They talked for 3 minutes about how fat Dark had gotten, and then for 2 hours about baseball and strategy, bunting, that kind of stuff. Who was the best hit and run guy. In 13 years of owning the A's, Finley had fired managers at will. Dark was his 6th manager, and again his 12th manager. He was hired in 1974. The A's would go on to win the World Series for the 3rd straight time that year.
And who did they beat in the World Series that year?
Dodgers in 5.
Yeah. And then what happened to Dark after 75?
See you later.
Gone again.
And they won their division that year. They got swept by the Red Sox in the ALCS. That ALCS Game 3 was the end of that dynasty. That was the Game 3 at Oakland was the first baseball game I ever went to.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's
so
you.
I came in, my time was perfect. Right at the end, literally the last game of the dynasty. Dark said about the A's enigmatic owner, Charlie Finley, people think Charlie's dumb because he asks many crazy questions. He's not dumb, he's brilliant. here's a few of the things that Charlie Finley tried to implement from early on, in the 60s. He wanted night games for World Series. That's all there is now.
Done, yep.
He wanted interleague play.
Done.
That's been a big hit. Colored uniforms.
Which is it.
3.
A's
3 for 3.
Those A's uniforms set the world on fire.
They're still good.
White shoes, mustaches, designated hitter. He wanted the pinch runner. He wanted colored baseballs. Those things didn't happen. But you can just see the way his mind worked was to try and get more, as Muhammad Ali said, Billy, more asses in seats.
That's right. But I'm saying if you have 8 ideas and 6 of them are implemented, you're doing pretty good.
Right?
I'd say so.
You know?
Right. So, that's funny that Dark wins. The A's win 5 division titles in a row, 71-75. Dark winning the last 2, and then he's fired after the 75 season. So, next up, Thomas Satch Sanders, one of the great players in NBA history for the Celtics. He got hired by Harvard to coach Crimson basketball. Harvard, not a powerhouse in the Ivy League back then.
No, he didn't. He had a rough time. He went 40-60 in 4 years, and they expected a lot of big things because he had won 8 titles as a Celtic. So they thought, he'll come here. He's a smart guy. He'll get this whole program turned around.
Yeah, his first year he went 11-13, and the next year 12-13, and then it just got worse the next 2 seasons.
I like this one. Team captain Tony Jenkins missed a crucial practice for Satch's team. Why? He was in Detroit being interviewed for a Rhodes Scholarship. 2 years earlier, Jim Fitzsimmons averaged 24.2 points per game, but was sitting out his last semester to focus on his grades. So was Walter Hines, an all-city second-teamer from New York. So they could get players, but they weren't players first. They were literally student athletes, and they were students first. This was not UNLV. They were, when it came down to it, to choose between basketball and their studies, they chose their studies. So he was a first-round pick out of NYU. Thought this was another sign of the times. How did he find out he was a first-round pick? He read about it in the paper the next day.
Can you name the most famous basketball player to come out of Harvard?
Out of Harvard.
Okay, not Bill
Can
Bradley. Can you?
Not really. I would consider this to be the most famous. A short but bright career. Jeremy Lin.
Oh, that's right.
That's right.
Linsanity.
That's right.
Though it was really funny. I know a guy who thought he went to Stanford. So he started talking to him about, isn't it great Stanford won today, Stanford this? And Lynn's looking at him like, why do I care?
It is the Harvard of the West.
It is the Harvard of the West.
Taking Part is Everything is a story about the St. Petersburg 3¼ century softball club. And it's about a group of elderly guys playing softball. And I found it hysterical. Their star outfielder is 88 years old. Another guy's playing with a pacemaker. Their 91-year-old catcher was born in 1883.
And he doesn't bathe.
Oh, is that right?
He doesn't bathe either, yeah.
And you have to be at least 75 to play on the team.
That makes you a rookie.
The 88-year-old guy says, yeah, I'm 88, but I run like a 75-year-old. So.
And in this game, that makes all the difference.
He went on to say, you lay down, you die. I believe a lot of us wouldn't be living if we weren't playing ball down here. So that was just a nice, I think it was only 1 page long, but a nice tribute to these older dudes.
But they did have a former Major League pitcher, Ed Stauffer. He hit 30 home runs, and 9 went over the fence.
The people section, there's a bunch of stuff in there this week.
I like Joe Namath in the pantyhose commercial.
People forget how famous that was.
Oh, that was a really...
That made him.
Right?
Yeah. And, he was a playboy. He didn't mind, putting on some pantyhose.
Broadway Joe.
Yeah.
Right? For those of you who don't know, it pans. It starts at like at this person's feet, and it's going up, because obviously this woman is pretty tall, and then, she's got some pretty beefy, stocky legs, but they're in good shape, and then it finally gets to him, and it must have been shocking. I was 6 years old, so I don't really remember it. I just remember like the uproar or the notoriety it caused. But Joe Namath The commercial said something to the effect of, anybody's legs can look like $1 million in pantyhose. Do they even, do people still wear pantyhose?
I don't
Mark,
know.
do you wear
Mark?
pantyhose?
No, it's been a year or two.
You wear a girdle.
You wear them.
Corset.
I just wear them over my face when I go into a liquor store. That's it. That's it. I'm just hanging
Just
out.
to say hello.
So that's why that most wanted list looks
Yes.
so familiar.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Billy, Rosemary Davis.
Yeah, she wasn't allowed to box.
What?
The Omaha Golden Gloves tournament director said women and girls are for wrestling, not boxing. Where you get all that?
Yeah.
Yeah, nowadays he'd get knocked out by one of those said women.
Yeah.
Like a Ronda Rousey.
No, thank you.
No.
George Blanda was a quarterback for a long time.
And kicker.
And kicker, right? And he was in a parade during Mardi Gras. At age 46, the Raiders' backup QB had just one complaint. They kept introducing him as a place kicker, not a quarterback. And he said, come on, I've thrown 300 interceptions. 277 to be exact. I mean, the passing game back then, you can understand why they just ran. Because if you go back and look, he had some years where he threw 40 interceptions. Now, you put that, what's he doing? But the game was just so different. They had to have dropped back. They were supposed to throw it to one guy, and if he was covered, you threw it anyway.
I just remember his leg was pretty good. He kicked something like 48, 50-yard field goals, and he was those straight leg kickers.
Right. And he kicked for forever. I mean, when we had Bob Thomas on, Bob Thomas was the fourth leading scorer in Bears history. Number 3 was Walter Payton, a running back, obviously. And number 5 was Blanda. And Blanda played a long time with Houston and the Raiders. So to think that he's the 5th all-time leading scorer for the Bears, I mean, here we say he's 46. I think he played another season for the Raiders. So, he played a long time. He was basically the Gordie Howe
Or Tom Brady.
Right. That's
Late
right.
40s into the 70s.
Yeah.
And then, I forgot. I was going to say something slipped my mind. I got nothing.
Senior moment here from Bill Hoffman.
No, I was going to ask Mark if did you see Blanda play? Because you've seen
I
everyone
did.
else in here.
Well, not in person, but I saw him on TV.
Oh, did you? Okay. So,
I would watch him on TV all the time.
My dad had Raiders season tickets back then.
I mean, I remember him. I don't remember.
Right.
seeing him
It's
play.
more of a name.
Yeah.
More of a name. Right around, this is right around that time when we started to become interested in these kind of people. NC State is the number 1 team in the country right now. David Thompson showed why. 40 points, 14 rebounds in a 113-87 win over Duke, and then another 35 points when they beat Clemson. I mean, he must have just been something.
I remember him with the Nuggets. He was my favorite player because he was so incredible.
Yeah.
He could jump out of the gym. It was just so amazing.
And then Mark, you have that story that famous NBA last day of the season between Thompson.
right.
Thompson and
73.
Gervin,
Yeah.
like where one scored 60 something and the other one scored
Well, the first
70.
and they must not have played at the same
No.
time, right? So whoever did it first scored 63
I think it
points,
was, and then
they were up, and so that meant the other guy needed to score X amount to
10
win
more.
and they did.
Yeah, it was David Robinson, wasn't it? 73?
David Robinson scored like 71 or 72
Yeah,
points, and I remember there was
David
no team.
Thompson.
No, you were mentioning David Robinson.
Yeah, I was thinking the wrong one, but I know Thompson had like 63.
Yeah.
No, but David Robinson did score 71 or 72
Yeah.
points on the final game of the season.
He did.
For the Spurs against the Clippers, and that game wasn't televised. It was like,
Wow.
It was a mini cam game back in those days, which was back when the television station had to send a cameraman to shoot the game themselves.
My brother took his daughters they've been to one Laker game, and they went to the one Kobe had 81.
Wow.
Which I always think is just funny because, they must, the next game Kobe goes for 36 and they're like, oh, he really just didn't play that well,
Yeah, it was Thompson going against George Gervin, and
Right.
George
Yeah.
Gervin ended up winning the score.
Oh, did Gervin win it?
Yes.
Right, Thompson won first, then Gervin
Yes,
played later
that's
in the
it.
day.
He'd prefer a good book is a quick little weekly article on track and field for Sports Illustrated about a guy named Tony Waldrop. He was a great runner and a smart guy, ran the mile indoors fast, 3:55 mile. Can you imagine that?
No.
That's insane.
That's sprinting.
It
And you
is.
just keep going.
Yeah.
Like it'd be you and I, we sprint to a mailbox that's 20
Well,
feet. Go
when
to
I
us.
used to run,
Yeah.
what is, in air quotes,
You
run.
were running for a while.
Yeah, but you know how you would do it. You'd run, and then you would sprint at the
Yes,
very end.
yes, yes.
And all I keep thinking about is they did that the whole time and probably faster.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, when Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, which was considered at that point, one of the greatest achievements ever, and now Roger Bannister running just under 4 minutes would finish 50th, in a
That's
race
right.
with 50
That's right.
other, milers.
I think the record is 3:43.13 now.
Yeah.
So yeah,
3:40.
That's
unheard of. I tell you, this was another one of those that I was this close to just going, another track story. But I decided to do a little bit of research on it, and it only because it so fits with the title of the article. He'd prefer a good book. He said that he hadn't read a good novel or gone to a campus play in a while. So obviously the guy was a smart guy. In 1976, an Olympic year, this guy's an All-American. He's setting records, and he just stopped running. He said that it wasn't fun anymore. Said he never regretted it. He ends up getting his PhD and becoming a researcher at University of Texas Southwestern Medical. His name's Tony Waldrop. From there, he's a professor of molecular and integrative physiology at University of Illinois, then back to UNC as vice chancellor before moving on to the University of South Florida, where he was provost and executive vice president before finally ending his career as the third president of the University of South Alabama. So he truly did prefer a good book. So I just thought that was crazy that, here's a guy who's like, I'm going to quit running. And you're like, well, really? You're really good at that. No, he had other things in mind. That brings us to Jimmy Connors.
Jimbo
Comes on strong.
Yes.
The cover story written by Kirkpatrick. It's a toss-up whether Jimmy Connors irritates more people than he beats regularly on the court, but everyone knows where he belongs on the court. That's the sub-headline of that. There were so many tours back then that there was the U.S. LTA was what the Connors was playing, the United States Lawn Tennis Association, right? I mean, you had to look up what the L stood for because now that doesn't mean anything. He drops out of college, went to UCLA. I didn't know that, Mark.
Yeah, 1 year at UCLA, and I won the NCAA championship.
As a freshman, yeah.
But to me, what's so amazing for people that don't understand how dominant he was the number one ranked player on the ATP circuit for 160 straight weeks from 74 to 77. That's just insane.
Right.
But he lost. But Mark, but he lost. Yeah, that's right. But he lost that for 1 week, and then he kept going again for another 60 weeks. I mean,
is that right?
Yeah. It's just amazing.
And he's
84 weeks
before McEnroe and before Agassi and
right, kind of bridged.
Just that his rivals were Ili Nastase, who was the one tennis player he had a hard time with. But
he dominated Arthur Ashe.
Right.
He had good success against Stan Smith.
Yeah.
He didn't do well against Bjorn Borg.
Later on
15,
he did not.
Yeah.
What was he?
8-15.
Yeah.
And I saw Jimmy Connors one time in my life. To this day, I remember it was probably 20, 30 years ago, and it was in a sporting goods store. And I go, "That's Jimmy Connors over there." What did he do? But I should have gone up to him, but apparently he does enjoy his privacy. So
it'd have been an interesting, interaction.
Yeah,
it might have been fun.
Yeah,
he didn't get along with the other guys on the tour. That's a lot of this article right here. He's 21 years old. He stays in different hotels than they do. He doesn't eat with them. He doesn't play doubles. He's really what's called they called him a small-time cocky punk. So he wasn't endearing to the elder statesman, if you will.
I can't get into his head. I'm just imagining or thinking his processes, and maybe Curry can elaborate on this, is that they're my enemies. They're, that I'm trying to beat those guys, so I'm not their friends. I want something from them.
Yeah.
So why not be buddy for them?
Yeah.
They said the thing that bothered people was his on-court antics. Like he bounced the ball 18 times. flipping off the judge after a bad call, or he'd put the racket between his legs and act like he was doing something with it. And it seemed to turn off a lot of people. Like, that's just not the classy way you play tennis.
Well, they mentioned all these guys that he was beating. The one guy he couldn't beat or was having trouble with was Eli Nastase.
Yeah.
That's the one guy that he did become friends with.
Yeah.
I don't remember Nastase as being this dominant, really good player. I just remember the crazy Nastase.
That's
that
right.
Was, yelling at umpires.
Angry. Me too.
So that's who Jimmy chose to mentor in a way. He started playing when he was 2 years old with his mom and grandmother. His grandmother, known as Two Mom. His senior year, he moves to L.A. He's coached by Pancho Segura, playing kids like Dino Martin, the son of Dean Martin.
Right.
Dino kept betting Jimmy. Bad move.
Exactly. Yeah.
Kept losing. He drops out of UCLA. He's not a fan of practice, but says, I'm not scared of anybody. I can destroy them. And I just kept thinking, man, could you imagine being 21 years old? You're talking about some of the legends all time, Stan Smith, Newcomb, Rod Laver, Arthur Ashe. That's quite a list right there. And you're like, yeah, I'll beat the out of them, you know? And yeah, he's dating Chrissy Evert. His career takes off. Her career was already pretty much, she was, in fact, he was known as Chrissy's boyfriend. He did not like that.
But you go back to 1974, though. He was 99-4. He won 15 of the 24 tournaments he entered. That's how dominant he was back in those days. No matter what you thought about him off the court or how he treated people or what he was like on the court in terms of his antics, you can't take away that he was unbelievably talented.
No question. One of the all-time greats. Connor's career would take off, as you just mentioned, number one for over 3 years. But a year later, he and Chris Evert called off their engagement. Kirkpatrick wrote that for Sports Illustrated 50 years ago. In 1969, Curry was hired by SI, where he spent 27 years as a senior writer specializing in coverage of college basketball and tennis. He was with Sports Illustrated when that meant something. Co-wrote 2 New York Times bestsellers, one with Jim Valvano, the other with Dick Vitale. You might have heard of those two guys. He's a charter inductee into the U.S. Basketball Writers Association Hall of Fame, won the Kurt Gowdy Award from the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame in 2001. So, Curry, thank you very much for giving us a few of your minutes today.
Wow, well, thank you for that great opening. I had forgotten all those things.
I often say when we're talking to you or Bob Ryan or Peter Vesey, I mean, your resumes, I'm like, really, we could talk to you for 20 minutes and 10 minutes of it would be going over the things you've done in your career. So that was just a short synopsis. Curry, this article with Jimmy Connors on the cover and as we mentioned, Chris Evert on the inlet there, so you have to open it up to see it, which doesn't do all that well in this day and age of digital because you really only see Jimmy, and I would think that having Chrissy on the cover would have helped sell that. But anyway, I digress. It's 1974. Jimmy's just getting started. In fact, I think it says the controversial Jimmy Connors on the cover or something like that. He really started to take off at this point and evolve and became one of the all-time greats. Did he evolve off the court at the same pace?
Not for a while. I wouldn't say. As you said, this was in 1974. Jimmy was in the spring. I think we did in the spring, and he was just getting started. He was, he played on this. He didn't play on the main tour where all the big name pros played, which was called the WTA. It was Lamar Hunt's, and it was the ATP Union sponsored this tour. And Jimmy was off on another tour playing tank towns like Roanoke and with all due respect, Roanoke, Omaha, Paramus, and he was playing a field of nobodies. And the reason being was that his manager, Bill Reardon, managed that tour and also managed Connors. And Reardon wanted him on that tour. And so Jimmy really didn't play against the great players until the majors, until, Paris and Wimbledon and the U.S. Open. He never really faced the the Stan Smiths and the Arthur Ashes of the day on a regular basis until those tournaments. And as you said, he just started to take off in '74, which was his first great year, actually. But off the court, Jimmy was one of the first bad boys of tennis, of course, followed by McEnroe and the rest. But
Nastasi as a mentor will do that, right?
Yeah, and I think Nastasi was his mentor, was Jimmy's mentor. He's a good friend of his, and of course he was the first one that started all this stuff. But Jimmy took it to a new level, and his verbal abuse would not be tolerated. And these days, I mean, he wouldn't survive some of the tournaments if he was talking like that then. Did he expand his role off the court? I think all of us mature. I think he grew up and he got married. He didn't marry Chris, which of course was a huge shock to everybody back in those days. And he kind of, after he left tennis, unlike McEnroe and Courier and some of these great players of his day, did not stay in tennis, did not stay broadcasting. He kind of has retired to a quiet life out of the limelight, out of the spotlight. I was just thinking, you talk about that cover in '74. 17 years later, 17 years, he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated after the U.S. Open, which he did not even win. He was so popular and guys probably remember this, and he made an unbelievable run to the semifinals, beating, kids half his age, and he was 39 years old at the time. And I did the story, and we, Stefan Edberg won the tournament, beating Jim Courier in the final. We had Jimmy Connors on the cover because he had captivated America, really, though, for 11 days. He just kept beating people and coming up with these unbelievable shots at the age of 39. And in that time, he won 5 U.S. Opens, he won 2 Wimbledons, he made one of the great careers in tennis, even while staying, a very kind of abusive guy on the court. He was never very close to his competitors, and that started out early on in the story I did on him when he played on this tour. He never even stayed in the same hotel with the rest of the guys on this tour. He was off to himself, and he was the young prince of tennis, and people kind of derided him for not playing the great players. But in that, I think the previous year, maybe 73, maybe 72, I'm not sure, but he was only 21 at the time, maybe 19, 20, 21. He faced Stan Smith 3 times, beat him all 3 times, and yet at the end of the year, they made Connors and Smith co-number ones, and this stuck in Jimmy's craw. He always was kind of the me against the world guy, and he was very controversial. He would say anything, and he was upset at this stuff like this, where he beat these people and didn't get the credit for it.
When you go out to do a story on an athlete, there has to be some relationship. How was your relationship with Connors?
Well, that's a great question. I had to cover Jimmy in tournaments, and I had to write about all the bad stuff he did and write some, real critical stuff through the years. We did not have I didn't really have a personal relationship with him ever. I mean, except when he first started. I mean, I have a picture of he and I in those days on that tour, and he was much more talkative then to me. But as we, went on the circuit down through the years and him doing all this stuff, I covered most of his big tournament. I mean, we had him on the cover winning Wimbledon the 2 times he did it and winning a couple of the other Opens, and I always did the story. But there were never really long interviews with him. My colleague, the great Frank DeFord, who was my best friend on the magazine, we lived together. We lived in Westport, the same town, Westport, Connecticut. Our kids grew up together, and I was a great friend of Frank. Frank wrote the great story on Jimmy Connors, and Frank got close to his mom and his manager Reardon, and did a lot of research and stuff. And Jimmy gave him some time to talk to him, which Jimmy would never do me because I had written all this stuff about it. So that's the way that worked. But Frank wrote a great story about Jimmy being raised by his mom and his grandmom to play tennis and rip guys' hearts out. And I think the title was something like Raised by Women to Destroy Men or something like that. It was a great title. But Frank did one of his great stories on Jimmy Connors.
In your article, you said something, I think, he exposes only so much of himself. He is hiding the rest. What did you mean by that? I mean, was he such a private person that it was hard for him sometimes to let people know the true Jimmy Connors?
Well, again, that was early on. And, he hadn't even won his first major that year. It was that year that he started winning them. Actually, that's wrong. He won the Australian in January, and I did the story in the spring. But at that point, at that time, the Australian was not that big a deal. But he went on this is just an example. For that year, he went on to win Wimbledon and win the U.S. Open. So he won 3 majors. He was not allowed to play in Paris that year because he was on this sort of renegade tour, and the ATP did not recognize him in the rankings. So he didn't even play in Paris that year. And who knows, if he had, he would have won the Grand Slam.
Wow.
Because he won all the others. But as far as, I wrote that story again before he started to really come out on the court and scream and yell and show all his emotions. I'm sure that's where that line came from. He was much more quiet when he first started out.
He was very good at using his third finger, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. The story I wrote on him when he made the great run to the U.S. Open semis, again, remember now, he was 39 then, and he was beating all these younger players, and America was watching this. I mean, he was way over the hill. I mean, he hadn't won the Open for 5 years. He hadn't, really been a factor. And all of a sudden, he starts beating these people at the U.S. Open and becoming a factor. But I will say the authorities, the Open, gave him some favors. For instance, they allowed him to play every match at night, so it wasn't that hot. We're in New York in September where it can get really scalding. But he was allowed to play all his matches at night, which kind of turned off some of the other competitors. And Jimmy was allowed, I think if you go back to that story, look at that story, I quoted him in some of his matches. He was just brutal against the chair umpires. And I said in the story, he should have been defaulted. He should have been thrown out of the tournament several matches. But they allowed him to do this. So I think, over time, people just went with this. And then McEnroe followed. And McEnroe did the same kind of stuff. And they were allowed to get away with it. I keep saying this, but McEnroe, Nastase, Connors would not last in Grand Slams today through the third round if they were allowed, if they said what they said then. So it was a different world. I think people enjoyed it. I don't know if enjoyed is the right word, but they came to watch Connors to see when the blow up would come, and he never disappointed. even at 39, getting to the semis at the Open. I mean, he was infuriating constantly.
Did that help him as a tennis player or hinder him, that temper?
Oh, I think, for sure. Oh, for sure. He was one of the few guys, some guys that get mad, they can't play mad. Jimmy and McEnroe were the opposite. They could play, infuriated and screaming at everybody and getting angry and smashing balls in the crowd. And I think they played better and better. Yeah, I think they deliberately got their mindset in that frame of mind to get mad at everything and play better. And when they played each other, that was, of course, classic.
Well, you mentioned that he did not get along with the other players. Was that also somewhat of a motivational tool for him? You know, I'm trying to beat these guys. I'm not going to be friends with Stan Smith or Arthur Ashe. I want to, you know.
Yeah, I think so. I think he was like a prize fighter in that respect. You know, he didn't want to get friendly with any of his opponents because, you know, he wanted to beat them. And I think that's much different from today. I think, for instance, you know, Djokovic, Federer, and Nadal were all kind of friendly off the court and socialized together and saw each other a lot and gave each other great respect. Connors, McEnroe, and that ilk never did that. I mean, never. Well, McEnroe, I guess, gave respect to Bjorn Borg because you couldn't get under Bjorn's skin. But for instance, McEnroe and Connors' dislike for each other, I think it remains today. And they, you know, they would come right out and say it, you know, at matches and stuff. Nastase was kind of more of a clown. He kind of took everything. He wasn't really mad. He just sort of pretended he was mad. But to go back, you know, Jimmy's great rivals, a little older than him, were Stan Smith, Arthur Ashe, in that era. And he and Ashe were not friendly. And, you know, Jimmy came from a blue-collar family in East St. Louis, across the river, as they say in St. Louis. And I think there was a lot of racism going on then involved. Jimmy grew up with that. And I think there was a bit of that in his feelings toward Ashe. They played a great final in '75 at Wimbledon, and it was and Jimmy was heavily favored, and Arthur Ashe just played this really interesting match where he just kind of rope-a-doped Connors and beat him in one of the great upsets in history in a Grand Slam. And I don't think Connors ever, later years, he would always point to that. He never forgot that. And he and Stan Smith did not have good relations. I quote Stan in that story way back there that you're pointing out in '74. I think I have some quotes in there from Stan about that the tour isn't losing any sleep over Jimmy not playing with us and stuff like that. And you know, in those days it's not today, but in those days it was the style to, after a match, to wait and walk off together with your opponent. This was in the Grand Slams and everywhere. And it got to the point where Stan Smith would not wait for Jimmy Connors after a match, even if he beat him or lost to him. He wouldn't wait for him. He'd do a quick handshake and walk off. And he told me at one point, he said, "I'm not going to wait around." And, you know, he's waving to, and there's tons of media around him, which was true at the matches on the court. And Stan would say, "I'm not waiting for that." So he walked off. I mean, there was no love lost between these guys. I'll tell you a great incident. And, you know, I think I used this in a story later on. Arthur Ashe told me this story that one time he was walking on the grounds of Wimbledon with his new fiancée, who he later married, a girl named Jeannie Motasami, who was, I think she was from Haitian blood, just a gorgeous girl. And Arthur and Jeannie are walking along the lawn at Wimbledon. It's one of the off days, and there's nobody around. And here comes Jimmy and Gloria Connors, his mom, Jimmy's mom. And remember, they don't even want to see each other. And here they come, and they can't miss just crossing paths. And as they come up to each other, Arthur stops and says hi to Jimmy, he says hi to Gloria. And he says, "I want to introduce you to my fiancée, Jeannie Motasami." And Gloria looks her up and down and says, "Oh, you must be one of them Creole broads." I mean, that's the kind of stuff that went on those days. So, you know, there were two different cultures, two different worlds that the Ashes and the Connors were from. And that's the way it was.
Wow.
In terms of pure talent, where would you rank Connors compared to other players of his generation and then future generations?
Well, if you break it down, you know, serve, return, overhead, you know, the different basics, backhand, forehand. I think Connors was the greatest returner of serve ever until Djokovic. Now, I retired, I stopped covering tennis, 20 years ago, before Djokovic and Nadal and Federer came on the scene. But of course, I've watched them through the years. Of course, everybody says they're the three, best they ever played because of the majors they've won. And everybody points to Djokovic, especially return of serve. And he is spectacular. But, going back, I remember Connors, he grew up practicing on indoor wood floors at the St. Louis Armory. There were these shellac floors where they would hold military drills and concerts and stuff. And he learned to return serve by hitting everything on the rise, standing way inside the baseline and taking every ball early, serves and other rallies, just taking everything early and smashing it back as hard as he could. He did not hit the ball nearly as hard as, for instance, Borg, or, in later years, Sampras or Agassi. Agassi, by the way, was another great return of serve. But in those days, Connors was considered the great returner. They always ask, what would guys do in this? How would Connors fare these days, in this era? Connors, Borg, McEnroe. And John has always kind of said that, kind of acknowledged and admitted that, it's such a different game. The rackets are so different. I mean, they were playing with wood rackets back then. And Jimmy used the racket. Jimmy was so quick with his hands. He used a racket made by Wilson, made of steel. And I remember getting one of those rackets, and it was like the ball went off it like a trampoline. And how he could keep that ball in play. I mean, it just stunned his contemporaries, that how he could play so well in rallies and keep the ball in play with that steel racket, playing against wood guys. Of course, it made the ball go faster, but it also, you just couldn't control it. Connors was the only guy that could control it. So, I mean, he's one of the great players ever. I mean, there's no question.
We think of the big three, of course, Nadal, Federer, and Joker. But the list of names from back then and 50 years ago is stunning. I mean, to win a major back then was, you had to beat a who's who to even get to the finals.
Yeah. Yep, and that's why winning 8 in those days is phenomenal. I mean, I can't remember my records. I should look this up. McEnroe had around that, I guess. Borg won the French. Of course, Borg was especially won the French Open like 7 or 8 times, which was considered ridiculous until Nadal came along,
right,
and bettered that by several.
Wimbledon five in a row, right?
I'm sorry.
Didn't Borg win Wimbledon 5 times in a row?
Yeah, and that was absurd until Sampras came along.
Right.
And then these other guys came. So, but Jimmy's return of serve would have kept him in most matches with these people. I think he, as I said, he was not a big heavy hitter. His serve was nowhere near what these guys hit it now. For instance, and I don't think the great American player Pete Sampras that came along after him, who won Wimbledon so many times, had a huge serve. But McEnroe and Connors' serves back then weren't even considered the best of their days, and that's how it's kind of remarkable how they won so much and so many times. I mean, it was guile, it was their heads. I mean, they would just beat guys with their brains and their touch, and it was such a different game than it is today.
I was reading your article, and it said about his on-court antics. They bothered some of the players, stuff like bouncing the ball 18 times. You talked about saying things to the judge. You put the racket between his legs. That was the true Jimmy Connors, because a lot of athletes have like the alter ego. They're this guy on the field or on the court, and then off they're someone different. But this was the true Jimmy Connors that you saw?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he was kind of like that in his private life. I mean, he didn't let it out. He was very private, but I think he had some. His mom, as I say, he was raised by his mom and his grandmom, and she was Gloria, as I pointed out in the episode with Arthur Ashe. She was a character, and she raised him to as a it's us against the world, son. And I don't think he really ever had the social niceties that these other guys have had since him, since Jimmy. I think that's why he never did that well. I think he started to do some TV stuff, and he just didn't get along with enough people.
That can't hurt you.
Yeah, which is, that's the difference between him and McEnroe, who changed completely. It's a joke for me to see McEnroe become such a media sensation over the last 20 years, since he hated all media and abused the media more than Jimmy did. And, was as bad or worse than Jimmy.
Well, that happens with a lot of athletes where they hate the media while they're playing, but once they're done playing, it's like, well, hey, it's not such a bad thing,
I can tell you a funny story. I don't know, I'm getting off Jimmy Connors, but we're staying on tennis. Jim Courier, who was, a contemporary of Jimmy's and Andre Agassi's and so forth, great American player, has become really a terrific tennis announcer. He does a lot of stuff for the BBC, I guess he's on the Tennis Channel, which I don't see the Tennis Channel, but at the majors, he doesn't do American television. He works for the BBC, and I think he's the best of all the former players. But he was quite a controversial character when he played too. He kind of was in that. He wasn't as bad as Connors or McEnroe, but he had a huge temper. And one time, he and Agassi played in the final in the French Open. And they were considered by the French crowds to be ugly Americans because, they did all these antics and they acted spoiled and rotten, and, they showed it on the court. So here the two of them played in the French Open, the men's final, and the French were not interested much at all. I mean, the match went on, and, it wasn't like a European play. I mean, they didn't like these two. Anyway, I ended up writing a story about these two ugly Americans playing for the French Open title in Sports Illustrated. And, I had some critical and cynical and kind of funny things to say, I thought, in the story. And so 2 weeks later, I got a personal letter from Jim Courier. I think it's the only personal letter I ever got from an athlete. And he basically said, Curry, he said, this is the first time two Americans have played in the French Open for 30 years, and all you can talk about is how bad how ugly and antics we were and how awful we were. He was really angry. So,
I didn't think it was a love letter.
I didn't have a lot of close relationships with these tennis players who I had to write the bad stuff about them. I mean, McEnroe almost punched me twice. A couple times he came close to trying to punch me out. And but that's a different story. You want a Connor story?
Oh, we'll take any good stories.
Take a McEnroe story.
Yeah.
When McEnroe first started, the magazine they wanted me to do a story. He was getting to be this really big name in tennis, and it was the winter. I can't remember when year, but it was one of the first years he started. I went to Milan, Italy, and interviewed him, and he was real nasty. He didn't want to cooperate, talk to me at all. I mean, this is a kid. He was like 18. And here's Sports Illustrated coming to interview this guy. And he didn't want any part of it. He abused me. He said, I don't need this. I mean, he was like that from 18. So anyway, I write this story, and I write about how Irish he was. And a long time ago, Al McGuire, the great Marquette basketball coach, told me there were two kinds of Irishmen. If you guys are, maybe any of you guys are Irish, I don't know, but he said there's lace curtain Irish and there's shanty Irish, and there's a big difference. And so in my story on McEnroe, I pointed this out, and I said McEnroe was nothing but shanty Irish. Well, little did I know, and I'm Scottish. I mean, I'm Scotch. I should know this, but it really offends Irishmen to call him shanty. So his family went crazy. I mean, his dad wrote a letter to the magazine and said, "This is ridiculous. This guy's calling a shanty Irish about." And McEnroe never forgave that. So it's 2 years later. I haven't I haven't seen him up close. I've been covering him for the next 2 years. We're in a Davis Cup match in Grenoble, France, and he finishes kicking some guy's butt badly, and he's walking out. There's only about 3 or 4 American journalists there, and the USTA guys are walking with him, and he's walking on the side of this press conference. After the press conference, and we walked up to him to try to, get a few words. And he looks at me. He's about 5 feet away. He looks at me, and he kind of lunges. He kind of says, "Kirkpatrick." He said, "Shanny, that's the worst thing that's ever been written about me," he said. And he lunges toward me, and the USDTA guy, who's a friend of mine, he grabs McEnroe. He said, No, John, no. And he's about to punch me there. And I said, I had some witty rejoinder like, well, if that's the worst thing that's ever written about you, you'll be very fortunate or something. I don't know.
You should have said you're proving.
Yeah, he went after me again. He came again. Yeah, they had to hold him back.
You're proving my point right now, you shanty Irishman.
Yeah. And I was, I don't think he would have hit me. I'm in about his size, so I don't know. I could have fended him off. Throw up some defense.
Getting back to Jimmy, at the time of this article, as we mentioned, he's engaged to America's sweetheart, Chris Evert. You would think that would help him with his reputation with fans, but it didn't, did it?
Well, I think it did then. Yeah. Oh, they were America's sweethearts. They both won Wimbledon that year, and that's where the romance really blossomed. They were everywhere around London. They go to parties and hotels and dinners out, and they were in the players' box, and everybody would see him. And it was like, I think they called it when they won. It was called something like the Lovebird Double or something. The British press went berserk, and I pointed out in the story that they were really close to getting married. At least that's what my sources in both families told me, that they had planned in May. They were almost the Evert family. This had been going on for about a year, but it really blossomed that year. The Evert family wanted the wedding to be in May, before the French Open even. And apparently Gloria Connors put the nix on that. She said something like, nobody can win a tournament on their honeymoon or something. I think I used that line in the story. So she nixed that. But then they go ahead and they have this great summer together, and there were rumors they went to South Africa for a tournament, and they actually had their rings. They watched their diamonds in the South African diamond mills being crafted into their rings right there in South Africa. They picked out their rings from these diamonds they had seen, pick their own or something out of the mines. So it was that serious. And there were all these rumors that they were going to get married after Forest Hills being the U.S. Open. But it didn't happen. And then the romance kind of went off the rails, then it got back on, and they were on and off for several years. And then Chris, of course, had romances with and married John, who's the British player.
Lloyd? John Lloyd?
Oh, can't remember. John Lloyd. Chris went ahead and married John Lloyd. She divorced him and married Andy Mill, the skier, and had her 2 children with Andy. And then, of course, got married to Craig Norman for about 15 minutes. So, and she had many romances through the years, with celebrities. So it wasn't like, she went on her sad way. Jimmy, meanwhile, I think it was only a couple years after he broke up with Chris, but he ended up marrying a model. I can't remember her name, but he's been married forever to her with his children.
Patty McGuire.
They have 2 children, and they're still married as far as I know.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is, as much as a recluse as he likes to be, and he lives up in Santa Barbara now, I believe, but he does a podcast with his son Brett, who's a producer at the Tennis Channel. So he actually,
he does?
Yeah, so he's actually doing a podcast. He's actually out there talking just general stuff with his son.
Well, I'm sure he's very good. at it. I wanted to do after he had that great run to the Open in '91. I wanted to do a book with Jimmy because I mean he was the biggest thing. You guys, I don't know if you guys remember, he was the biggest thing in America after that tournament. I mean, he had all these. Pepsi signed him this long-term Pepsi-Cola. He had all these sponsors come along. Everybody wanted a part of Jimmy. And his manager then at the time was a friend of mine, and I talked to him about, because I said, this is when Jimmy should do, he hadn't done a book yet. And I said, this is when Jimmy should do his book right now. And, I hadn't had that great relationship, but his manager went to him and proposed it to him, and he said, well, I think I might do that. But then they took it to Gloria, his mom, who was still pulling the strings then when Jimmy was 39. Gloria was still alive and telling him everything to do. And she hated me, of course, because I had used a lot of stuff in the stories. And she said, there's no way you're doing a book with Curry Kirkpatrick. So there went that. Well, I'll tell you what, in his book, he finally did do a book, and the most controversial thing that came out of it was I think he related that Chris Evert had to have an abortion, and she was furious at that, by the way. But I told him, when I was going to do the book, I said, look, you've got to tell in the book your relationship with all the guys and the Ashes and the Smiths and the McEnroes. You got to tell everything. And, these guys sit down and do a book, and they say, oh, yeah, okay, I'm going to tell you. And then they don't, because they just don't want to offend, I guess. They don't want to do stuff that will, get them in hot water with people. But, and his book was no different, except for this Chris stuff. He didn't go into all this stuff with Nastasi and McEnroe and Agassi and all this stuff that he'd had in the Ashes and the Smiths.
The reason you would want to read the book.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
well, I'm sure it sold a lot of copies, and as a matter of fact, Andre Agassi's book is one of the great sports books by an athlete ever.
It's a great book.
Maybe the best.
Yep.
Yeah. So there are these tennis players, they can, when you get them away from the court and get them to sit down and talk about their life, they can do it.
But I have to go back. Why is it? It sounds like when you speak about Connors or McEnroe, they sort of sound like the same guy. How is it that they couldn't get along? I mean, they're the same guy.
I think, I think you're right. I think McEnroe was influenced by a lot of what Connors was doing, as McEnroe was a teenager in his late teens, and he was watching Jimmy be so offensive and yet be so good and be able to bring it to the court and not allow it to affect his game except in positive ways. And I think McEnroe saw that a lot and started, he started to become Jimmy Connors. And of course, when they played each other, it was a mirror. It was a mirror of each other. And they never played great matches. The matches were always terrific. But they were never great tennis because they were just always, yelling and screaming at each other and snarling and being nasty and mad and mean. And it was like a prize fight. It was like a a boxing match.
You've mentioned that run in 91, and yeah, he beats Krickstein, I think, in the quarters, but the match equally as memorable was the one against Paul Harhus, the four lobs. New York City, as you mentioned, it's nighttime. I mean, you hear the crowd. That's the loudest I've ever heard a crowd with each return of that lob. It's unbelievable. I think tennis peaked that night. I mean, that was as good as tennis was ever going to get, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, and you mentioned, that thing started in the very first round, when he played John McEnroe's brother, Patrick. And I wrote this down because I looked it up. This is his first round match. Connors playing Patrick McEnroe. Connors was down 6-4, 7-6, and 3-love, 40-love in the third set. And he came back to win the set and win the match. It was like 5 hours long.
It's like 2 in the morning,
finish till
wasn't it?
like it didn't finish like till 2 in the morning. It just captivated the whole country. And from then on, he kept playing. You know, he beat Krickstein. He came from like 5-1 down in the fifth in that one, and then the Harhus Lobs, of course. And it was just amazing what he'd do every night he'd come out there. And McEnroe had the great line. He said, you know, as Connors is progressing, he said, you know, I can't believe what Patrick is. Patrick goes to bed every night thinking, what kind of a monster have I created? You know, by blowing his match in the first round of the Open to Connors.
So
yeah, as you said, I mean, who puts a loser of a major golf or tennis tournament on the cover? I mean, we did,
Right.
you know. And
Right.
that says it right there. I mean, you put the loser on the cover.
And Curry, it was the right call.
Yeah, of course. And he didn't even get to the finals.
Right.
He didn't get to the finals. And I wrote the story, of course, and I wrote how it was, you know, he stole the Open. I mean, and the cover of the Open had this great photo of him snarling away on the court with his leg kicked up, his knee kicked up, and it said the people's choice. And, you know, it split, and a subhead was something like how Jimmy Connors stole the U.S. Open. Didn't he? Poor Stefan Edberg. He won a tournament. And in fact, during the tournament, he kept calling Connors Mr. Open. He would address him as Mr. Open. And Sampras was saying stuff like, you know, Jimmy is so great for tennis, none of us really can argue about it. You know, none of us can be upset about this. He's bringing more and more people to the game. More and more people are watching this tournament because of him. And it was amazing. I mean, you know, really.
It really
when you
was.
think about it.
So we do a little segment on the show called 50-50. It's basically I give you a 50% chance to answer a trivia question from 50 years ago. So, and there's a grand prize
How much do I win? How much,
you
how much
know,
money do I win?
one of our very first guests asked the same thing, and you get exactly the same he got, 0. But so we had talked earlier, 1974.
I'm terrible at trivia.
That's okay. 1974 was memorable not just because of tennis and other sporting events. It was the year of the streaking. Remember streaking in 1974, where people took their clothes off and just went.
I didn't know that was the year streaking became.
Oh yeah, 74 was its pinnacle. In fact, Sports Illustrated in that issue even refers to, you know, streaking. You know, what colleges had the most streakers. Anyway, the most famous incident for streaking was the Oscars, when a streaker ran right behind David Niven, who's presenting an award. So in honor of that streaker in 1974 and 50 years ago, true or false, the winner of the Best Picture Oscar in 1974 was The Exorcist. True or false?
Oh, I'm going to say false.
You are correct. You win. It was The Sting, in considering one of the great upsets in Oscar history. But so you win your $0 there.
Nice.
You know, I would have thought you would have asked me who was the actor that the streaker streaked behind, and I would know his face, and I probably would have forgotten his name.
It was David Niven.
David Niven, yeah.
But that was 1974 was the year of the streak.
I can wrap this up, Curry, pretty much confident that you have never been asked a trivia question about streaking before, and probably never will again. If things go well for you, that will be a one and done.
Yeah, a one-off.
Hey, Curry. I'm looking at the issue with Jimmy on it, and the controversial Jimmy Connors, and you basically in a way introduced the country and the sports world to what would become a legendary tennis player, both on and off the court. These issues, we keep telling each other how much we're learning by going back and reading the work that you guys put in 50 years ago. And I can't thank you enough for coming on. For Bill and Mark and I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks
Thank
so
you.
much. It's been a pleasure. I'm flattered that you would have me on.
Well, we may reach out another time. You just there's
Jimmy
so
and
many
Chris. Jimmy and Chris are on the cover again in July.
and what we'll do then is we'll call you and we'll talk about Chris Everett.
Yes, and in September there's a streaker on the cover, so we're coming for you.
There you go.
Have a great night, Curry. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You know what? I'm amazed by these guys who were in the moment, 50 years ago, and is their ability to their
To recall. Their recall is amazing.
It's unbelievable. He's like, he was down 7-6, 6-4, 3-love, 40 love.
Yeah.
I kid you not. I'm like, did I buy milk?
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable.
It just puts them right back there. It's like these what they're doing. It literally puts them back in that tennis court.
There are just a couple things too that are just like, wow, I can't believe. Like, I had no idea that Jimmy Connors' chance to win the Grand Slam, he didn't have a chance because he's on this,
different
podunk tour
Yeah.
because his manager is making him play on the USLTA, and he can't even play the French Open.
But it's interesting. Was tennis not more popular then than perhaps it is now?
I
Not
think
to
you're
say
right,
it's
Mark.
not popular.
I think it's more than.
But I think in those 70s, that was really the years where it became, it was a major sport. People really had the personalities.
It was another
like Jimmy.
event.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the greats of all time, and I'm talking about Kirkpatrick.
Yeah.
When you think of Sports Illustrated in its heyday, and I meant to ask him his thoughts on
That's what we meant to.
on
Yeah.
Sports
Yeah.
Illustrated
Yeah.
because I have to imagine that that hurts a little bit.
Yep.
But Kirkpatrick was often the byline. So
And he was often the guy. There's a story, maybe another time, that Bob Knight went after him too. There's Bobby Knight. Get
it
the hell
makes
out
sense
of yeah.
because these guys aren't your friends.
Yeah.
You have to be fair,
Right.
Yeah. And they
you know,
are
you-
fair.
You have to report what is happening.
Yeah.
And you know what, Bob Knight and Jimmy Connors, if you don't want to be portrayed like an ass, don't act like an ass.
Yes. Yep.
It's not like you get something about Bob Knight and Jimmy Connors and go, wow, that's shocking. I can't believe he acted that way. These guys always acted this way. This guy's writing about it. Clean up your act is all I have to say.
And the same thing, the guys that were sent out in those days were seasoned professional Hall of Fame writers.
Yeah.
I'm not criticizing people that go out now, but they're usually younger
There's no
people
comparison.
that they don't
There's
have
no
any
comparison.
Yes.
I ask any of you who are listening to this, go and read a Sports Illustrated. It is written by writers.
Yes.
I mean, there's
Yes.
whenever we talk to these people, it's not a coincidence that they've written books
Yeah.
and
Multiple
and
books.
Multiple books. He mentioned Frank DeFord. I mean, that guy was phenomenal. Curry, great writer. The list goes on and on. I mean, that, like we said, Mark Cram Sr., Tex
I
Small.
think the problem now is just the attention span of young people.
Yeah.
It's everything's social media, everything's in small bites. And it's
140,
hard for them to read anything of length.
Yeah.
All right, that's our Get Off My Lawn segment.
Get off my lawn.
Let's move to the For the Record. I think all of us have this one because it just jumps out at you, which is kind of funny because the For the Record almost always starts with a synopsis of the week in the NBA, the week in the ABA, then the NHL. And so you have to kind of search for it. But then, wow. And I'm like, is that the one they're talking about?
Yeah.
Billy.
Yeah, Tim Horton, who helped the Leafs to 4 Stanley Cups. He passed away in Toronto, but he's known. If you go to Toronto, who's ever been there, and even somewhere in the East Coast out there, they have Timbits. That's what he's known for. It's a donut shop. It's a donut and coffee. Timbits are huge.
Tim Hortons.
Yeah, Tim Hortons. That's right. Tim Hortons. Excuse me. Yeah, Tim Hortons and Timbits. I had Timbits a lot of times when I was in Toronto.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
he dies in a car crash drunk.
Yep.
Unfortunately, he stops at a friend's house who tries to convince him to stay the night, doesn't. And he's driving home from a game from, I think, Toronto to Buffalo, or vice versa, one or the other. And,
Going fast.
His widow sold her share of the chain, which included up to 40 stores, for $1 million.
Oh.
It's now worth $14 billion.
Wow.
So,
yeah, because they're all over the place.
Yeah, they're the Dunkin' Donuts
thank you.
of Canada.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. They're
And
just so good.
You guys got another one from For the Record?
I don't.
That's the other thing is Horton was he was a great player.
He was.
You know?
There's really, I mean, other than that, he's just the.
Yeah, but his legacy now is donuts and coffee.
Yep.
On the 19th hole, I had one rider that I thought surmised the swimsuit issue perfectly. It's Dominic Flory from Dayton, Ohio, writes, although I enjoy your annual bathing suit issue as much as the next guy, one of my favorite issues from year to year is the one that carries all the letters in protest of it. And trust me, they are plentiful.
That must be
They are
Ed
plentiful.
Snate's buddy.
Did they realize how tame they were compared by today's standards?
Oh, boy. Yeah. It's
Right. Oh, my
changed.
goodness. Yeah. Hey, next week, I believe March 11th, 1974, another legend on the cover, Mr. Hockey, Gordie Howe.
Yep.
We will talk to Gordie Howe's final season. He was 93 years old. He played in Hartford. He was actually 51. He turned 52, I think, before the season ended.
Yep.
Right.
It was in Hartford. The play-by-play announcer for that team was in his first season. He would later do 39 years with that organization. Chuck Caton, a Hall of Fame broadcaster. Those two, they had 1 year together, and it formed a bond and a friendship that would last until Gordie's passing. So that's next week on the Past Our Prime podcast. Any passing thoughts from either of you guys?
No, I just take it in when you interview someone like someone like Curry. They just have so much information, and anytime you just throw one thing out, they run with it.
Oh my gosh! Right? Next thing you know, he's like, "Well, you don't want to tell me about the time John McEnroe tried to hit me."
We're like, I never. We do.
It's stuff that's buried in the back of your brain, and something triggers it, and all of a sudden it just comes flushing out.
It does. Yeah. Well, it's another history lesson week by week. So that's it for this week. I'm Scott. That's Bill. That's Mark. Jeremy over there in the corner. See you next week on
See ya.
Past Our Prime.
Fantastic.